An explosion turns the skyline into a blizzard of glass and ash while a single figure walks through the heat like he missed his bus, completely bored and unbothered. And the first responders stop because nothing in their training explains a man who leaves no line on the cursed energy scans. Sorcerers throw instantaneous techniques, and the air answers with lightning. But the strikes meet a motionless calm and scatter into the street like children's fireworks. Civilians watch as a special grade curse rears up and then folds like a lawn chair beneath a single, casual shove. Phones record his blank profile. Headlines call him anomaly, and the strongest wards blink uselessly against a force that registers as nothing at all. Nobody can explain why the man yawns in the middle of a battlefield, or why the thing that should have been invincible collapses into an ordinary casualty after he palms it away like an irritation. This is only the beginning. Worse is coming. If you stick around, you'll hear how a bored man with unseen strength breaks rules and breaks reality. Subscribe now if you want to know what falls next, because once this spreads, nothing will be the same and you won't be able to unsee it. The city split open like brittle ice long before anyone could name the thing that caused it. A thunderous gouge of sound and falling concrete that left whole blocks suspended in a rain of glass. And through that wreckage a man in a plain hoodie walked with his hands in his pockets like he was late for a sale. He did not run, he did not shout, and he did not look like someone who had just stepped into an impossible battlefield. He looked bored, and that boredom made the air around him more unnerving than the smoke and screams. Emergency teams arrived to a scene that should have read on every cursed energy scanner, and on every ward as a tidal anomaly. But every indicator flatlined, something had opened and left no signature, and the blankness itself set trained people on edge. When a special grade curse, all teeth and shadow, rose from the shattered subway and charged like a living crater, it met his hand as if the world were a mildly inconvenient fly swatting itself against his palm. The thing folded and became ash before anyone could cast a binding, and the phones did not stop recording long enough to explain what that meant. Word that a phenomenon left no cursed energy traces spread faster than the smoke, because Jujutsu sorcerers do not treat blanks casually, and blanks force questions that never have comfortable answers. Megumi was there within the first hour, moving with that cold, analytical patience that treats every anomaly like a problem that can be solved by classification, and he walked the perimeter calling measurements and parallels as if numbing would make sense of it. Yuji followed behind with the baffled, earnest energy of someone who thinks themselves late to the party but still wants to bring snacks, and he kept asking the wrong, human questions. Is he okay? Does he need help? Which only made the trained eyes around him tighten. Gojo arrived last, not because he could not, but because he wanted to see how the scene arranged itself on its own. He stood on a roofline with his blindfold off for a beat, and the man below looked up and shrugged like meeting another commuter, which made Gojo grin in a way that said curiosity more than threat. The probes and wards the team threw at the man bounced like pebbles off glass. Techniques that normally peel spirit and bone apart hit an odd, indifferent resistance, and rearranged the physics of strike and effect without explanation. And Gojo watched that with a scientist's glee that edged toward something dangerous. He tested, but not in the way enemies are tested. He applied a fraction of his power, manifesting a thin, careful slice of infinity to see whether absolute distance would make the thing notice, and the anomaly responded by yawning and stepping aside, which made Gojo laugh and then frown, because the laugh meant novelty and the frown meant the novelty had edges. Megumi, trying to fold this into his syllogism of sorcery, found every premise breaking: no cursed energy, no binding, no reciprocal technique, and the failure of his categories felt like a physical bruise, something a trained brain experiences as a sudden, hot panic that it has been outmaneuvered by the world itself. What happened next forced escalation not through violence but through classification, because institutions exist to turn events into boxes, and when the boxes fail, they do the only thing they can: widen their nets. The Jujutsu Tech Network flagged the incident as an unclassifiable phenomenon and upgraded its threat levels suspiciously fast, sending a quiet, bureaucratic pulse through other agencies that translated into armored deployments and classified briefings. A blank on the system is an unacceptable variable, and governments do not tolerate unknowns that cannot be explained on a spreadsheet. Civilian cameras turned the man into a million thumbnails of the same indifferent face, and the phrase "special grade" anomaly trended in channels that usually traded celebrity gossip, and that public awareness pushed response teams to move from observation to containment planning. Gojo listened to the chatter on a secure line, then put a hand on his chin and said plainly that whatever this was, it would not stay a tidy file for long. Saitama, for his part, did not understand any of those words. He had half a mind to look for a supermarket sale and the other half to find a decent place to nap, and when people called him anomaly, he tilted his head as if the label were a mildly unpleasant insect. He let the sorcerers poke with low-level techniques until someone unsheathed a stronger move, and the air itself seemed to swell with intent. When a tracer set to map cursed momentum arced toward him and turned into static, the man clapped once, not in triumph, not in victory, but in the way someone would clap at a street performer who had finished a trick. That single, careless clap made the nearby wards shiver and, crucially, made a specialized analytical team in a distant lab see readings they had never been taught to translate. The absence of cursed energy produced data noise that looked, mathematically, like a new kind of vector, and someone in that lab coined a word that would spread: null soul. There is a momentum to systems that are built to respond, and when their measurements fail, they change tactics quickly. Gojo recommended observation layered with soft containment. Megumi argued for cataloging and study, and Yuji wanted to talk to the man like he was a neighbor who had the wrong apartment number, which made Gojo snort and shake his head with something close to fondness. The first order went out to sweep the surrounding blocks, to find collateral curses that might have been attracted by the anomaly, and they found more lesser spirits that had nested near the epicenter now lay flattened, or simply gone, and every removal tightened the noose of public concern because removals like that are not accidents. An occupying special grade, one that should have required a squadron of sorcerers and a field of talismans, had been reduced with negligible effort, and that reduction rewired the way every strategist in the chain imagined future encounters. If this man could cancel a curse by indifference, then the whole calculus that separated sorcerer from spirit had been compromised. By the time the sun dipped and the city lights began to flare through a haze of dust, someone in a command van sent an encrypted message to higher-ups and used words like existential contingency, which converted abstract worry into immediate protocol. Gojo, still curious and still smiling in that way that did not belong on a battlefield, asked the man a single question out loud: "What are you?" And Saitama shrugged and answered in the kind of voice you use when you hope this conversation will let you get home sooner: "I'm just looking for a sale." The absurdity of that exchange ricocheted through the team and hardened into policy within hours. Do not assume this is a sorcerer. Do not assume this is a curse. Do not assume you can contain it. Somewhere deeper, below an impressionable layer of the world that records threats in older languages and older hunger patterns, a presence that tasted power like a palate noticed the disturbance. Inside a constrained body that had known centuries of violence, an amused voice flicked its awareness toward a new variable and smiled. The night closed with files being written, with military channels opened under classified tags, and with a slice of information that could not be ignored. The man left the scene the same way he had arrived, walking away with his hands in his pockets while the city stitched its wounds. And behind him, the structure that held sorcery together had cracked along a seam that would not seal itself by morning. The immediate catastrophe had been contained with an absurd economy of force, but the response had already escalated from local confusion to national concern, and something within the world's older, hungrier intelligences had turned its attention. That attention, once given, does not easily unwind. The morning after the first encounter opened every newsroom and every secure line to the same strange picture. A man who left no cursed energy and a trail of ruined assumptions behind him. And in that vacuum, the sorcerers moved with a professional, escalating curiosity. Saitama still wandered through the aftermath in the same calm, distracted way he had walked through the wreckage the night before, buying a convenience store snack as if he had stepped off the wrong train. His boredom remained a constant, and that boredom made the more frantic reactions around him feel almost theatrical. The higher-ups at Jujutsu Tech decided that observation alone would not be enough now. Now meant tests, and tests meant a sequence of tactical gambits no single sorcerer had practiced for, because none of their drills prepared them to measure absence as a force. What the teams prepared instead was a new language of constraint, words built from collective technique rather than from a single master, combinations meant to probe what the scanners had not, and that procedural choice would change everything. On the ground, those combinations took shape as a technical choreography meant to translate null into datum. Megumi's constructs would sketch geometry into the air. Others would thread small, disciplined releases of cursed energy through those shapes, and technicians monitoring from a distance would attempt to map the interaction like reading a seismograph. Megumi Fushiguro organized the field teams with the same dry, clinical precision he used to set up Shikigami. His gestures were minimal, his commands exacting, and even under pressure his mind prioritized taxonomy over panic. The new tactical development everyone started calling a resonance net was not a weapon so much as an experiment. Dozens of mid-grade sorcerers timed short, interleaved pulses of energy in a lattice designed to catch whatever slipped between known signatures. Hopping the lattice would vibrate in a way that turned absence into presence. When the net snapped shut around the man, the result was not the normal shudder of a domain collision, but a mathematical oddity. The instruments showed negative phase readings that bent the team's assumptions, and those negative readings demanded a different kind of answer than any of them carried in their pockets. Seeing those readings made Gojo Satoru do something rare. He moved from amused spectator to hands-on experimenter, and he did it with the kind of temperate, gently dangerous smile that warned of a mind at half-cocked play. Gojo arranged a controlled confrontation that respected protocols and deliberately avoided escalation into violence, because he wanted to see what this absence actually did to the architecture of technique. He let a thin band of infinity curl toward the man like a measuring tape, and then watched how the man reacted to physical limits that were not meant to exist. Yuji Itadori stood nearby, asking stupidly human questions and offering the only honest reaction any average person could, all mixed with the panic of someone who understands that the rules of the world have been rewritten on a whim. The man clapped at Gojo's tests as if they were small amusements, and each clap translated into a failure mode on the monitors. Seals that should have held trembled, constructs that should have snapped instead dimmed, and the resonance net, newly refined and stretched taut by combined minds, recorded a sustained null phase where sound and motion behaved like things observed through the wrong end of a mirror. When the field teams shifted from experiment to defense, they tried a different approach, provoke response. Sorcerers drew on old, animal instincts of combat and created staged hostilities to see whether emotional or reactive states would correlate with any measurable output from their anomaly. They conjured lesser curses as bait, they painted illusions and staged explosions, and they fed the scene with the kind of sensory assault that usually draws out technique and signature in loud, predictable bursts. Saitama reacted by moving as if mildly inconvenienced, by swatting away threats with the casual force of someone clearing leaves from his path, and that nonchalance became a revelation. This absence was not a fragile null, but an active cancellation, a property that did something to the underlying mechanics of curse formation itself. The baited curses collapsed in ways that suggested not just defeat but ontological reversal. Where curses are usually born from malice and feed on attention, they now found their feeding grounds evaporating into a kind of vacuum that left behind data no exorcist had a protocol for. That revelation shifted perspective in a way no one in the initial teams had expected. This was not merely a new threat to be contained. It was a systemic variable that could rewrite how the Jujutsu hierarchy functioned if it spread. The tactical implications raced through command rooms faster than any single strategy could be written. If absence cancels curse formation, then containment is irrelevant unless you can account for how null behaves at scale. And if null behaves like a vector rather than a void, then the instruments anyone trusted might be measuring the wrong thing. The field teams responded by changing shape again, layering medical, arcane, and technological observers around the perimeter, domain knowledge fused with data science, because the problem was now as much about interpretation as it was about force. In the center of all this, Megumi Fushiguro watched with a scholar's frustration, trying to write axioms from the ashes of failed assumptions, while knowing that every hypothesis he tested would change the rules for the next. But systems do not adapt in a vacuum, and attention calls old hungers awake. Far beneath the human networks that recorded and reclassified, the things that live on appetite and history, ancient, hungry intelligences, felt a disturbance their language could not neatly name. In the lowest folds of the cursed world, an amused awareness tilted its head toward the ripple. A presence that had spent centuries cataloging anomalies noted an anomaly with a predatory smile on its face, the kind that savors the possibility of a game. Sukuna registered the null phase not as a threat to be sealed, but as an oddity worth tasting, and that first flicker of interest was dangerous, because curiosity in his kind turns quickly from amusement into obsession. By afternoon, subtle changes that no human analyst could link together had begun to occur. Lesser curses that should have fled instead clung longer at the edge of the resonance net, and a pattern of behavior in the ruins suggested not mere collapse, but a kind of audition, as if something older wanted to know whether this absence was a meal, a toy, or a rival. As the sun slid west, the teams on the ground finalized a risky plan to draw out more information. A coordinated, layered ritual that combined Gojo's safe, exploratory infinity, mid-level sorcerers, timed pulses, and Megumi's shikigami arranged to pull and hold spatial anomalies long enough for technology to sample. It was the kind of plan that required faith in procedure rather than certainty of outcome, and when they enacted it, the city held its breath because nothing about this moment was reversible. The ritual worked in a way no one could have predicted, not by capturing the man, but by changing the field around him in ways that woke old intelligences and made them look. And as those older eyes sharpened their gaze, something in the shadow architecture of the world leaned forward. That lean was not a fight yet, and it was not a withdrawal. It was a turning of attention that would soon be noticed by those who could not pretend ignorance. The stakes had changed from an oddity on the street to a systemic variable that demanded answers from every corner of a fragile balance. And as teams packed up for a second night of watchfulness, the first true predator to take interest had already started to speak. By the third day, the incident had stopped being a local anomaly and started behaving like a structural crisis inside the Jujutsu world, because every system built to manage cursed energy was now producing contradictory reports. Monitoring stations recorded areas where curses were simply ceasing to exist without the usual surge of exorcism signatures, while other regions reported unstable fluctuations, as if the environment itself could not decide whether cursed energy should accumulate or disperse. The bureaucratic layers above Jujutsu tech did what bureaucracies always do when patterns threaten order. They built committees, issued emergency classifications, and tried to turn the unknown into a manageable document. The anomaly was upgraded from unclassifiable phenomenon to strategic irregularity level 1, a designation that had only been used twice in modern jujutsu history, both times involving disasters that reshaped entire districts. None of those previous cases involved a bored man wandering around convenience stores looking for discounted groceries. Saitama did not notice the classification change because he did not know classification existed, and that was part of the problem for the people trying to analyze him. He spent most of the morning trying to find a grocery store rumored to be running a limited-time sale on boxed curry, walking past barricades and investigation teams with the absent-minded patience of someone navigating a construction zone. Sorcerers stationed along his path had been given strict orders not to provoke confrontation, but they still watched him like scientists observing a walking contradiction. Every scanner confirmed the same thing: no cursed energy output, no trace of technique, no fluctuation corresponding to movement or emotional response. And yet curses within several hundred meters of him were vanishing at a rate that no trained squad could replicate. Inside Jujutsu Tech's central command room, the conversation had shifted from curiosity to containment strategy, not because anyone believed they could overpower the anomaly, but because the balance between curses and sorcerers depended on predictable escalation. If an unknown variable disrupted that balance, the entire threat management structure could collapse. Senior analysts proposed a new tactical development known as environmental domain stabilization, a city-scale barrier lattice designed to isolate fluctuations in cursed energy density across entire neighborhoods. The theory was simple: if the anomaly caused cursed energy to collapse or disperse, stabilizing the environment might reveal whether his presence created measurable distortions in the field itself. It was the largest controlled barrier experiment attempted outside of a disaster zone, and deploying it in a populated city meant acknowledging that the situation had already crossed from investigation into emergency response. Megumi Fushiguro participated in the planning session with the focused intensity of someone watching the foundation of his entire discipline crack beneath his feet. His earlier attempts to categorize the anomaly had failed completely, and that failure forced him into unfamiliar intellectual territory. Instead of asking what Saitama's ability was, Megumi had started asking what assumptions about cursed energy might be wrong. If cursed energy formed from negative emotions, and if curses fed on those emotions to grow stronger, then an entity that erased curses effortlessly without producing any detectable energy might represent the opposite phenomenon entirely. The idea disturbed him because it suggested a natural force outside the known sorcery ecosystem, something that existed independently of the centuries-old hierarchy sorcerers believed defined their world. Meanwhile, Gojo Satoru seemed less disturbed and more entertained by the implications. He leaned against the conference table while the analysts argued over barrier geometries and containment logistics, occasionally interjecting with questions that made the entire room pause. Gojo had already confirmed that infinity did not behave normally around the anomaly, and that single observation was enough to convince him the phenomenon deserved close attention rather than aggressive containment. When someone suggested using layered sealing techniques to immobilize the man temporarily, Gojo laughed and pointed out that every attempt to measure Saitama had produced negative phase distortions in their instruments. "If you can't even detect him properly," he said casually, "what makes you think you can seal him?" That argument ended the sealing proposal immediately, but it did not end the pressure from the higher authorities overseeing the jujutsu world. Those officials cared less about theoretical curiosity and more about maintaining the delicate equilibrium that kept ordinary civilians unaware of the supernatural battles protecting them. If the anomaly continued erasing curses without explanation, civilians might notice the sudden absence of disasters that usually required quiet intervention from sorcerers. Paradoxically, a dramatic improvement in public safety could expose the existence of the entire Jujutsu system. That possibility forced the Leadership Council to authorize a new operational phase: controlled confrontation using high-grade curses intentionally released into the stabilized environment. The decision horrified several younger sorcerers, including Yuji Itadori, who could not understand why the council would deliberately unleash dangerous curses just to test an anomaly. Yuji argued that if the man could destroy curses easily, they should simply let him do it rather than engineering artificial battles. The senior officials dismissed the suggestion immediately, explaining that uncontrolled interference from an unknown entity could destabilize the entire curse ecosystem. If Saitama continued erasing curses at random, the imbalance might trigger unpredictable surges elsewhere, concentrating curses into catastrophic clusters. Their plan, however risky, aimed to measure the anomaly's effect under controlled conditions. By late afternoon, the environmental domain stabilization network activated across several districts, forming a layered barrier that subtly regulated cursed energy flow through the environment. The city itself did not notice the change, but every sorcerer monitoring the system felt the difference immediately. Normally, cursed energy drifted through urban areas in chaotic patterns influenced by human emotion, but now the barrier lattice forced those currents into stable channels like water through pipes. The experiment transformed the entire district into a controlled laboratory where even small disturbances would register instantly on the monitoring network. When the first special grade curse was released into that stabilized zone, the reaction was immediate and violent. The creature emerged from a containment vault like a storm given physical form, towering above the streets with jagged limbs and an aura dense enough to bend nearby light. Its presence alone pushed the stabilization lattice to its limits, producing waves of energy fluctuations that analysts scrambled to interpret. Cameras and drones tracked the curse's movement as it rampaged through the empty streets toward the anomaly standing several blocks away. Saitama noticed the approaching creature only when the ground began shaking beneath his feet. He looked up from the grocery flyer he had been studying and sighed quietly, the way someone might sigh at unexpected rain. The special grade curse lunged toward him with enough force to demolish a building, but Saitama stepped forward and swung a single casual punch that erased the creature so completely, the stabilization network momentarily lost all readings in the area. For 3 seconds, the entire monitoring grid showed absolute zero cursed energy across the district. Analysts stared at their screens in stunned silence because the environmental domain stabilization lattice was designed to regulate energy flow, not eliminate it entirely. The punch had not just destroyed the curse. It had wiped out every trace of cursed energy within the barrier field like a shockwave of pure absence. When the readings slowly returned, they came back distorted, as if the environment itself had been forced to rebuild its energy balance from scratch. That moment changed the threat classification permanently. What the council had hoped would be a controlled experiment had instead revealed that Saitama's presence could reset the cursed energy environment on a citywide scale. If that effect expanded beyond the stabilization barriers, entire regions could lose their curse ecosystem overnight. Such a shift would not merely disrupt the Jujutsu hierarchy. It could erase the fundamental conditions that allowed curses and sorcerers to exist at all. And somewhere deep inside Yuji's mind, the ancient presence sharing his body stirred with growing interest. Sukuna had been quietly observing the disturbances from within his vessel, amused at first by the chaos spreading through the sorcerer community. But the moment the monitoring network registered absolute zero cursed energy, Sukuna's amusement sharpened into genuine curiosity. He had existed for centuries within the cursed hierarchy, ruling it through power and terror, yet he had never encountered anything capable of erasing the very substance that defined his existence. For the first time since the anomaly appeared, Sukuna began considering the possibility that this strange, bored man might be worth meeting personally. The 4th day did not begin with an explosion or a curse attack. It began with silence, and that silence spread through Tokyo's cursed energy monitoring network like a disease that analysts could not diagnose. Entire districts that normally produced low but steady readings of negative emotional energy suddenly registered long intervals of near-zero activity, the kind of absence that should have been impossible in a city of millions. The environmental domain stabilization lattice still functioned, but its data now fluctuated in irregular waves that looked less like regulated energy flow and more like a heartbeat that occasionally stopped entirely. The council overseeing Jujutsu operations had hoped the previous day's experiment would clarify the anomaly's influence, yet the results only proved something far more alarming. The ecosystem of curses and sorcerers was beginning to reorganize itself around a man who did not belong to that system at all. Saitama remained completely unaware that his casual actions were restructuring the supernatural balance of the city. That morning, he wandered through a shopping district that should have been crowded with civilians, yet several streets had been quietly evacuated by Jujutsu authorities preparing for the next stage of containment. Temporary barriers hidden within ordinary buildings created a layered observation zone that allowed sorcerers to monitor every block without attracting public attention. Saitama interpreted the empty sidewalks in the simplest possible way. It was early, people were probably still at work, and that meant he could browse stores without long lines. From a command center several kilometers away, tactical coordinators prepared a new strategy designed to answer the most troubling question raised by the previous experiment. If the anomaly could erase curses instantly, what would happen if multiple high-grade curses attacked simultaneously from different directions? The answer would reveal whether Saitama's effect operated as a localized reaction or as a broader environmental influence. To test that theory, the Council authorized the release of 3 special-grade curses into the stabilized district at carefully calculated positions surrounding the anomaly's location. The deployment itself represented a dramatic escalation. Special-grade curses were rarely used as experimental tools because each one possessed destructive potential equivalent to a natural disaster. Releasing 3 of them into the same urban zone meant trusting the barrier lattice and the assembled sorcerers to prevent a catastrophe. But the leadership had concluded that the anomaly's presence already constituted a crisis larger than any individual curse. If Saitama truly threatened the structural balance of the cursed world, delaying decisive analysis could make future containment impossible. The first curse emerged beneath a collapsed subway entrance, rising from underground tunnels like a nightmare-given skeletal form. The second descended from the upper floors of an abandoned office tower, its elongated limbs scraping windows as it crawled into the open air. The third manifested directly in the center of the district, erupting from the pavement in a storm of distorted limbs and screaming faces. Their combined presence instantly overloaded the environmental domain stabilization lattice, sending violent spikes of cursed energy through the monitoring network. Megumi Fushiguro watched the data stream scroll across his tablet with a tightening expression. The stabilization system had been designed to regulate normal fluctuations, but 3 special grades operating simultaneously pushed it into unstable territory. Megumi understood the Council's logic for the experiment, yet he also recognized the danger of miscalculating how the anomaly would react. If Saitama's previous punch had erased all cursed energy within the barrier zone, the simultaneous presence of 3 high-density curses could produce unpredictable consequences for the environment itself. Meanwhile, Yuji Itadori stood on a rooftop observation post, gripping the edge of the railing as he watched the monsters converge on a single intersection several blocks away. He could see Saitama walking casually down the street with a plastic grocery bag swinging in one hand, completely unaware that 3 of the most dangerous entities in the region were about to attack him at once. Yuji had seen powerful sorcerers defeat curses before, but he had never witnessed someone erase them the way Saitama did, like swatting flies out of the air. Even so, the sight of 3 special grades closing in simultaneously made his stomach tighten with nervous anticipation. The tactical development introduced during this phase was something the sorcerers had never attempted before: synchronized curse aggression. Instead of attacking individually, the 3 special grades had been conditioned through ritual bindings to coordinate their movements like a hunting pack. Their combined assault created overlapping waves of cursed energy that reinforced one another, forming a dense storm of negativity capable of overwhelming even experienced sorcerers. The strategy aimed to produce a level of pressure no single opponent could casually dismiss. Saitama noticed the first curse when it crashed through a nearby storefront window and landed in the street with enough force to scatter debris across the sidewalk. He stopped walking and stared at the creature for a moment with mild confusion, as if wondering why a giant skeletal monster had appeared during his grocery trip. When the other 2 curses emerged from opposite directions, forming a triangle around him, Saitama scratched the back of his head and sighed in quiet annoyance. From the monitoring center, analysts prepared themselves for another sudden collapse in the stabilization lattice readings. They expected Saitama to eliminate the curses quickly, perhaps with a single strike that would again erase local cursed energy. Instead, something slightly different happened. The first curse lunged forward with a roar that shook nearby buildings. Saitama stepped aside and casually tapped the creature's head with his fist, sending it flying down the street like a thrown stone. Before the monster even finished crashing through the wall of a parking structure, the second curse attacked from above. Saitama responded by jumping upward with effortless speed and flicking the creature away with the back of his hand, as though brushing dust from his sleeve. The third curse attempted to exploit the moment of distraction, surging forward with a concentrated blast of cursed energy that would have vaporized an ordinary sorcerer instantly. Saitama turned toward it with the same bored expression he had worn since arriving in the city and delivered a slightly stronger punch than before. The resulting shockwave did not simply erase the curse. It traveled outward through the entire district, rippling across the environmental domain stabilization lattice like a stone dropped into still water. For several seconds, every monitoring station registered chaotic fluctuations as the barrier system struggled to compensate for the sudden disturbance. Windows shattered across multiple blocks, parked cars flipped onto their sides, and every curse within the stabilized zone disintegrated simultaneously. The analysts had expected localized disruption. Instead, Saitama's punch had propagated through the entire barrier network, turning the carefully controlled experiment into a citywide energy shockwave. When the readings finally stabilized, the data revealed something unprecedented. The cursed energy density across the entire district had fallen to levels normally seen only in remote rural areas with almost no human population. From a rooftop observation post, Gojo Satoru watched the aftermath with a wide grin forming beneath his blindfold. The experiment had answered the council's question more clearly than anyone expected. Saitama's effect was not limited to direct contact with curses. It could propagate through the environment itself when sufficient force was applied. The city was no longer just observing the anomaly. Now the anomaly was reshaping the battlefield. And deep within Yuji's mind, the ancient king of curses began to laugh softly at the chaos spreading across the world he once ruled. Sukuna had finally decided that watching from a distance was no longer enough. When the news networks could no longer be kept silent, the incident leapt out of any single city's control and into every capital that tracked anomalies, because silence only delays a decision. Once the world knows an unknown can erase the fabric that defines a supernatural order, governments stop guessing and start building programs. A coalition formed almost overnight, not because nations trusted each other, but because the risk of leaving the problem nationalized was an existential gamble none could accept. Militaries mobilized advisory cells that paired field-grade officers with jujutsu analysts. And in a secure briefing room, the conversation stopped being theoretical and started being procedural. What containment looks like at scale, how to defend millions from the ripple effects of null, and whether the existence of an entity who could wipe cursed energy would destabilize global security in unpredictable ways. The pull of bureaucracy was practical and ruthless. When your tools fail, you invent new ones. The first tactical innovation to emerge from that pressure was something the military called the null containment vessel, a mobile unit that fused hard engineering with sorcerer seals into a single operational platform. NCVs were armored transports carrying synchronized sealing arrays and reactive talismans wired to deliver coordinated pulses, meant not to strike Saitama. That was impossible by doctrine, but to shape the environment around him in hopes of redirecting whatever vector his presence exploited. These vessels moved in distributed formations with a command node that ran a crude predictive model patched together from jujutsu heuristics, surveillance data, and live recordings of the resonance net disruptions. It was improvisation at scale. Engineers tried to learn a sorcerer's linkage patterns. Sorcerers learned to speak in binary rhythms, and everyone agreed on one brutal truth: brute force would not work, so they would try containment by feedback instead. On the ground, the deployment shifted the visible atmosphere of the city. Streets now contained parked NCVs that hummed like oversized bees, their crews a cross-section of military technicians and young, exhausted sorcerers fed on too little sleep and too much adrenaline. The vessels pulsed low-frequency dampening fields that attempted to stabilize cursed energy gradients long enough to allow rapid evacuation and to prevent citywide resets. That tactical development bought time, not victory, and time had become the most valuable currency. Analysts used it to map ripple predictions and to calculate safe corridors for civilians. Megumi, who had become the unofficial architect of many of these new procedures, stood for hours with a tablet that lay bare the lattice of variables he now had to manage: curses, null vectors, public movement, and the unpredictable yaw of an indifferent man who simply wanted a quiet life and a good bargain. The international response escalated in political terms as well. Diplomatic channels filled with frantic messages, requests for shared resources, offers of technical talent, and veiled threats aimed at any nation that might try to weaponize the phenomenon, because null could be a weapon if someone learned to wield it. Governments debated whether to classify the anomaly as a biological, metaphysical, or strategic hazard, and the terminology mattered because classification dictates jurisdiction. Some argued for the anomaly to be placed under military authority, others wanted it studied by academic consortia, and a few less patient states quietly prepared to take unilateral action if the coalition faltered. That looming possibility forced coalition leaders to accelerate containment protocols and to demonstrate results quickly enough to keep nations from going rogue. Meanwhile, on a rooftop where the night still smelled of dust and exhaust, Gojo Satoru watched a column of NCVs fan out and didn't look particularly impressed. He listened to the engineers explain their sync patterns with a half-amused smile, and then he offered one correction that made a room of PhDs blink. The arrays needed a human tempo, not a machine rhythm, because cursed energy properly reads intention. Gojo's insight forced another tweak, a hybrid protocol where sorcerers beat rhythms into the system while machines held ultra-stable baselines. And the first time that change ran, a containment ring held for 7 full minutes without catastrophic ripple. 7 minutes became a victory worth printing in briefings, because those minutes allowed critical infrastructure to be disengaged and for civilians to move through safe corridors. But the victory also came with an uncomfortable caveat. The containment was temporary and depended on active human involvement, and humans get tired. That exhaustion mattered because nowhere in the coalition's calculations had anyone fully integrated the ancient politics of the cursed world into an operational plan. The system that had been stabilizing human and supernatural interaction for centuries was not simply going to sit quietly while governments rearranged tactics. Powerful entities noticed opportunities, and among them was someone who never simply watched from a polite distance. Inside the vessel of an unwilling host, Yuji Itadori felt a shift that was more than the tired ache of long days. It was an animal sound of interest. Sukuna, the presence sharing his body, had been amused and curious, but with militaries attempting to harness Null as a strategic asset, the king of curses, amusement soured into calculation. The idea that mortals might engineer the death of an ecosystem that sustained his kind provoked something old and possessive. Sukuna started testing how much control he could reach for without waking the entire city. That testing changed the rules for everyone because Sukuna's awareness is not merely reactionary. It is tactical and predatory. Small curses that had previously dissolved around Saitama now behaved differently in pockets where military fields and sorcerer rhythms overlapped. Some clung to life, some fragmented and recombined, and a few began to exhibit emergent behavior that resembled coordinated resistance. Analysts in forward labs logged anomalous clustering around NCV perimeters where the hybrid protocol ran longest, and those clusters suggested an adaptation. If the world tried to shape Null into a weapon, curses might learn to hitch a ride on the edges of containment, exploiting the seams in human-made systems. That was a dangerous possibility because it implied the ecosystem could evolve in response to human tactics, and evolution in cursed entities meant new, unforeseen threats. Across oceans, embassies prepared contingency plans and private contractors offered to sell faster, better containment arrays, which only accelerated the arms race mentality. The coalition issued a statement designed to calm public anxiety. Containment is under control, evacuations are limited, scientific teams are coordinating. The public response was a mixture of relief and fear, because headlines could not hide the footage of collapsed buildings, and the evacuated neighborhoods whose skis now carried drone swarms and the glow of NCV fields. International insurers reclassified affected zones, and markets reacted as if a new kind of risk had been born. Yet none of that global machinery could account for one simple, human fact. Saitama had not tried to be a weapon, had not sought to change the world, and still walked the streets hungry for the mundane. At the end of the day, with NCVs humming and coalition briefings scheduled every hour, the escalation that always follows failed containment took a new direction. A covert unit authorized a risky operation to deploy a concentrated network of containment nodes around an expected route in hopes of isolating the anomaly for a sustained period. The operation did not seek to harm, it sought to hold and to observe, and its success would mean the coalition could study Null without risking citywide resets. The operation launched under thick cloud cover, the NCVs moving like a slow swarm to form a ring. Inside one of the command vans, analysts watched data streams and held their breath. And somewhere between the ring forming and the first pulses firing, a different hand moved. Sukuna, tasting the possibility of a world remade or ruined, reached toward a sliver of influence, a calculated, patient pull toward manifestation that would make the coming night much more dangerous than anyone in a briefing had imagined. The containment ring closed just after midnight, when the city had thinned to quiet streets and distant sirens, and the formation of vehicles and barrier nodes resembled a slow mechanical eclipse tightening around a single point on the map. Coalition analysts watched the ring assemble through satellite feeds and cursed energy telemetry, knowing this moment would determine whether the military sorcerer alliance could truly influence the anomaly or whether they were only delaying the inevitable. The synchronized system of NCVs and hybrid rhythm barriers pulsed outward in precise intervals, forming what commanders described as a containment horizon, a shifting perimeter designed not to trap Saitama directly, but to stabilize the environment around him long enough for deeper observation. This development represented the largest combined supernatural military operation ever attempted, and every nation involved understood the consequences if it failed. If the anomaly broke through this layered network the way it had shattered smaller experiments, then the world would have to accept a far more frightening classification: uncontrollable. Inside the containment horizon, Saitama walked through a quiet avenue lined with shuttered storefronts, holding a plastic bag that rustled softly with each step. He had noticed the unusual number of armored trucks parked along the roads, but his curiosity remained mild rather than alarmed. In his experience, cities often hosted strange exercises or construction projects, and none of them had anything to do with him. He paused briefly at a vending machine, frowned at the prices, and muttered to himself about how inflation was getting ridiculous. From the perspective of the command network surrounding him, that ordinary behavior made the moment even more unsettling, because dozens of surveillance drones and sensors were tracking a man who behaved like he had wandered accidentally into the center of a classified operation. When the containment horizon fully activated, the night air changed in a way that only sorcerers could feel. The hybrid rhythm protocol combined machine-perfect pulses with human intention, producing waves of stabilized cursed energy that radiated outward from the NCVs. The field resembled a slow tide moving through the city blocks, smoothing chaotic fluctuations and preventing sudden collapses of energy density. For the first time since Saitama had appeared in the city, the monitoring network recorded something approaching equilibrium. Analysts leaned closer to their screens, recognizing the significance immediately. If the field held long enough, they might finally measure how the anomaly interacted with a stable cursed energy environment. Megumi Fushiguro stood in one of the command vehicles, studying a three-dimensional map of the containment horizon. Each glowing node represented a barrier anchor maintained by a combination of soldiers and sorcerers working together under enormous pressure. Megumi had helped design the rhythm pattern now sustaining the field, and seeing it function on a city-wide scale felt surreal. For the first time since the crisis began, the data streams displayed patterns that resembled normal sorcery metrics rather than chaotic null distortions. Yet the stability carried its own tension, because Megumi understood how fragile the system truly was. If the anomaly reacted unpredictably, the delicate rhythm binding the field together could collapse instantly. Across the city on a rooftop observation point, Gojo Satoru leaned casually against a railing and watched the containment horizon ripple across the skyline. The coalition leaders had asked him to remain outside the operational center to avoid interfering with the experiment, but his presence nearby still provided a psychological anchor for the sorcerers involved. Gojo could feel the carefully balanced rhythm moving through the city like a living pulse, and he admitted privately that the hybrid protocol impressed him. It was clumsy compared to the elegance of a true domain, yet it demonstrated something new: human institutions adapting rapidly to a phenomenon that refused to obey their rules. For several minutes, nothing dramatic happened. Saitama wandered through the stabilized streets without disturbing the field at all. Sensors registered his position moving slowly between containment nodes, but the surrounding cursed energy environment remained calm. Analysts exchanged cautious glances because this behavior contradicted earlier observations. Previously, even minor interactions involving Saitama had triggered massive energy resets. Now the containment horizon seemed to absorb his presence without immediate disruption. The tactical development revealed itself slowly. Instead of canceling cursed energy outright, the anomaly appeared to neutralize localized concentrations while leaving the broader field intact. In other words, the containment horizon had forced Saitama's influence to behave like a series of small null pockets rather than a citywide shockwave. If the system could maintain that behavior consistently, governments might finally possess a method to coexist with the anomaly rather than simply reacting to him. Inside Yuji's mind, however, a different reaction was unfolding. Sukuna had been observing the containment operation with growing irritation. The hybrid rhythm field interfered with the natural flow of cursed energy, producing a stability that felt unnatural to an entity born from pure malice. Worse still, the field demonstrated that humans were beginning to understand how to manipulate the environment around the anomaly. If they succeeded, they might eventually neutralize the entire curse ecosystem without realizing it. Sukuna's amusement finally vanished. Within the depths of Yuji's consciousness, the ancient king of curses pushed outward with deliberate force, testing the boundaries of the vessel restraining him. The containment horizon masked subtle disturbances in cursed energy flow, which meant a careful surge of power might go unnoticed by the monitoring systems. On the rooftop observation post, Yuji suddenly staggered forward as a wave of pressure surged through his body. For a brief moment, the world around him blurred with violent color, and he heard laughter echoing inside his mind. Gojo noticed the shift instantly. His relaxed posture disappeared as he stepped closer to Yuji, sensing the unmistakable signature of a presence awakening. The containment horizon still pulsed steadily across the city. But inside that stabilized environment, something far older and far more dangerous had decided to act. Sukuna's power erupted in a narrow burst that tore through the rhythm pattern binding the containment nodes together. The disruption spread like a fracture through glass, destabilizing several barrier anchors simultaneously. Soldiers and sorcerers operating those nodes felt the rhythm collapse beneath their hands as alarms blared across the command network. The carefully balanced horizon began to unravel. In the command vehicle, Megumi watched the containment map flicker with cascading warnings. Sections of the field destabilized one after another as Sukuna's interference propagated through the network. The hybrid rhythm protocol depended on perfect synchronization, and once that synchronization failed, the entire structure became vulnerable to collapse. And directly at the center of that collapsing horizon stood Saitama, still holding his grocery bag and looking mildly confused by the sudden surge of distant explosions. For the first time since the crisis began, two forces capable of reshaping the entire cursed world were about to occupy the same battlefield. The first containment node exploded in a tower of fractured light, and that single rupture cascaded through the entire containment horizon like a chain of collapsing dominoes. Soldiers inside the NCVs shouted over alarm sirens as barrier anchors lost synchronization, and the rhythm pattern that had taken days to assemble dissolved into jagged pulses of uncontrolled cursed energy. Analysts watching the monitoring network saw their stabilized data streams mutate into chaos within seconds, because the system had never been designed to withstand deliberate interference from something as ancient and malicious as Sukuna. The hybrid containment strategy had succeeded in forcing equilibrium around the anomaly, but that same equilibrium gave Sukuna a stable structure to break apart. And once the first fracture appeared, the entire horizon began collapsing inward toward its center. At the heart of that collapsing field, Saitama looked up from his grocery bag as distant flashes lit the night sky. From his perspective, the situation resembled a city experiencing multiple construction accidents at once, because explosions echoed from different blocks while armored vehicles raced through the streets. He watched a barrier node disintegrate several buildings away and tilted his head with mild confusion, wondering if the authorities had scheduled some kind of nighttime demolition project. None of the alarms or tactical chatter surrounding the operation meant anything to him. All he noticed was that his walk home had suddenly become inconveniently noisy. On a rooftop observation point several blocks away, Gojo Satoru immediately recognized the deeper problem unfolding beneath the surface chaos. The containment horizon had not failed randomly. It was being dismantled with surgical precision by a presence manipulating cursed energy from within the system itself. Gojo could feel the malicious intent threading through the collapsing rhythm pattern like poison spreading through a bloodstream. He turned toward Yuji, whose body had begun trembling as the ancient entity inside him pushed harder against its restraints. Yuji struggled to stay upright as the pressure surged through his consciousness. His hands clenched at his sides while fragments of another will clawed through his thoughts. Sukuna's laughter echoed louder now, no longer amused but sharpened with predatory excitement. The King of Curses had watched the anomaly long enough to form a hypothesis, and now the collapse of the containment horizon presented the perfect opportunity to test it. For centuries, Sukuna had ruled within a hierarchy defined by cursed energy, where strength flowed through techniques, domains, and destructive power refined through endless conflict. Yet Saitama represented something that defied that hierarchy entirely, a being with no cursed energy signature, capable of erasing the substance Sukuna depended on for existence. That contradiction fascinated and irritated him in equal measure. The ancient curse wanted to see how such a creature responded to real hostility. Inside the command network coordinating the military operation, officers scrambled to salvage what remained of the containment strategy. Several NCVs attempted to re-establish partial synchronization between surviving nodes, but the network topology had already fractured beyond repair. Without the hybrid rhythm field maintaining equilibrium, the city's cursed energy environment began reverting to chaotic patterns amplified by the destruction of multiple barrier anchors. Megumi Fushiguro stared at the containment map as red warning symbols multiplied across the display. The stabilization lattice had been the coalition's best attempt at adapting to the anomaly's influence, and watching it unravel in real time forced him to confront a terrifying reality. Their carefully constructed system had never accounted for interference from another top-tier entity. The experiment had been designed to measure Saitama's environmental effect, not to survive sabotage from the King of Curses himself. "Containment is gone," one analyst announced over the command channel, his voice tight with disbelief. Outside in the streets, the consequences appeared immediately. The collapse of the rhythm field released massive surges of accumulated cursed energy back into the urban environment. Residual negativity that had been suppressed by the containment horizon now flooded through the district like a storm breaking through a dam. Lesser curses began manifesting in clusters across several neighborhoods, drawn by the sudden spike in ambient energy density. For most cities, this kind of outbreak would have triggered an all-out emergency response from local sorcerers. But this city now contained two anomalies. Saitama noticed the first cluster of curses when a grotesque shape crawled out of an alley and lunged toward him with a distorted howl. He sighed again, clearly annoyed that his walk had been interrupted twice in 1 week by strange monsters. Without even pausing his stride, he flicked the creature aside with a lazy backhand that erased it instantly. The gesture created a brief null pocket in the surrounding energy field. Dozens of nearby curses disintegrated simultaneously as the pocket expanded outward. From the command network's perspective, the data looked impossible. Instead of spreading destruction evenly, the outbreak of curses was being canceled in irregular bursts centered around Saitama's casual movements. Every time he brushed aside a creature, or swatted one out of the air, localized regions of the city's cursed energy environment simply vanished for several seconds before gradually reforming. Megumi watched the pattern forming on his display with growing alarm. "His movements are rewriting the energy distribution," he murmured. The more curses that attacked Saitama, the more null pockets appeared across the district, creating unstable zones where the normal curse ecosystem could not exist. Analysts had previously theorized that his influence might propagate through environmental shockwaves, but now the phenomenon behaved like a dynamic cleansing, effect spreading through combat itself. And that was precisely what Sukuna had hoped to observe. Inside Yuji's mind, the ancient curse studied the pattern with cold fascination. If Saitama truly erased cursed energy wherever he fought, then direct confrontation would reveal whether that effect could threaten even the King of Curses. The laughter inside Yuji's head faded into something darker. Sukuna was no longer testing the system. Now he intended to enter the battlefield himself. The city had already begun to fracture under the strain of competing forces, but the moment the King of Curses decided to move, the atmosphere itself seemed to tighten with an ancient hostility that had not existed moments before. The containment network was gone, the stabilization horizon had collapsed into scattered fragments, and cursed energy now flowed through the district in violent currents that felt almost alive. Emergency sirens echoed across evacuated blocks, while military units pulled back to safer perimeters, recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond conventional coordination. In the center of that unstable environment walked a man carrying groceries, completely unaware that a being worshipped and feared for centuries was about to test him personally. Yuji Itadori felt the shift before anyone else did. The pressure inside his chest expanded outward like a spreading crack through glass, and he dropped to one knee as the ancient consciousness sharing his body surged forward with overwhelming force. Yuji had resisted Sukuna's attempts at control many times before, but this moment carried a different weight. The King of Curses was not trying to seize permanent control of the vessel. He only wanted enough presence to reach the surface and interact with the anomaly. That distinction mattered, because Sukuna's curiosity had now reached a point where observation alone was no longer satisfying. Across the rooftops nearby, Gojo Satoru recognized the transformation instantly. The cursed energy signature erupting from Yuji's body carried the unmistakable authority of an entity that once dominated the entire Jujutsu world. Gojo moved closer but did not interfere immediately, because he understood that forcing Sukuna back into dormancy might provoke an uncontrolled escalation. Instead, he watched carefully, studying how the ancient curse would respond to the anomaly walking through the city streets below. The tactical development unfolding in that moment was unlike any previous confrontation. Sukuna was not emerging to destroy the city or massacre sorcerers, which would have been his traditional approach. Instead, he began extending narrow threads of cursed energy outward from Yuji's body, sending them through the chaotic environment like sensory tendrils searching for a specific target. These threads moved through the district with unsettling precision, bypassing clusters of lesser curses and ignoring the remnants of military equipment scattered through the streets. They were searching for the one entity that registered as nothing at all. Several blocks away, Saitama paused near a convenience store window to check whether the late-night sale signs were still displayed. He noticed the shattered glass across the street and the abandoned armored vehicles parked at strange angles, but none of it looked particularly threatening. Cities often looked messy after construction work or accidents, and Saitama assumed the authorities would clean everything up eventually. As he turned to continue walking, a faint ripple moved through the air around him, something subtle enough that most people would not have noticed. But this ripple was not an attack. It was Sukuna examining the anomaly for the first time. Inside Yuji's body, the King of Curses felt something that had not existed in his world for centuries: confusion. His sensory threads, capable of mapping the density and structure of cursed energy across entire battlefields, encountered a void where Saitama stood. It was not a suppression field or a barrier technique. It was simply the absence of the substance Sukuna had mastered during his lifetime. The realization irritated him immediately. If cursed energy defined strength in the Jujutsu hierarchy, then a being who possessed none should not even register as a participant in the system. Yet every report from the previous days confirmed that this man erased special-grade curses with casual gestures. Sukuna's curiosity sharpened into something more aggressive. He extended a thicker strand of cursed energy toward Saitama. this time allowing it to manifest visibly as a blade-shaped distortion cutting through the air. From Saitama's perspective, the attack looked like a strange ripple approaching him across the street. He frowned slightly, unsure whether it represented another curse or just some weird visual effect caused by the flickering streetlights. When the distortion reached him, he swatted at it absent-mindedly the way someone might brush away a mosquito. The blade vanished instantly. Not deflected. Not blocked. Simply erased. On the rooftop where Yuji struggled for control of his body, Sukuna's grin widened with dangerous excitement. The brief contact had confirmed his suspicion. The anomaly did not merely resist cursed energy. It annihilated it on contact as if the substance itself could not exist within that space. For a being whose power depended entirely on cursed energy manipulation, that discovery should have been terrifying. Instead, it made Sukuna laugh. Because for the first time in centuries, the King of Curses had encountered an opponent who did not fit anywhere inside the hierarchy he ruled. And nothing interested him more than breaking impossible things. The environmental consequences of that brief interaction spread across the city almost immediately. When Saitama's casual swat erased Sukuna's probing attack, a null ripple propagated outward through the already unstable cursed energy environment. Several clusters of manifested curses disintegrated simultaneously as the ripple expanded through nearby blocks. Military sensors recorded the disturbance as a sudden drop in energy density, followed by chaotic fluctuations. In the command center miles away, analysts realized with growing dread that the anomaly and the King of Curses had finally acknowledged each other's presence. If those two forces escalated their interaction beyond brief testing, the resulting shockwaves could destabilize the entire metropolitan region. Back on the rooftop, Gojo crossed his arms and watched Yuji carefully as Sukuna's influence grew stronger. He understood the implication immediately. The ancient curse had become genuinely interested in the anomaly. That interest would inevitably lead to confrontation, because Sukuna did not tolerate mysteries he could not dominate. Meanwhile, Saitama finished examining the convenience store window and shrugged with mild disappointment when he realized the sale signs had already been removed. He turned away from the empty storefront and continued walking down the street, unaware that one of the most feared entities in the Jujutsu world had just begun preparing to meet him face to face. Inside Yuji's mind, Sukuna's laughter faded into a quieter, more deliberate tone. The King of Curses had finished testing the anomaly from a distance. Now he wanted to step onto the battlefield himself. The night tasted of ozone and metal when the first true meeting finally happened, because curiosity and hunger do not announce themselves politely. They move like weather and make everything else rearrange in response. Saitama walked as he always did, deliberately unspectacular, a single figure among overturned cars and scorched storefronts, and his presence continued to rewrite the immediate environment in ways analysts still lacked language for. Across the jagged skyline, something older turned its face toward him. The movement came from inside a vessel that had been dragged into the light through a cascade of desperate tactics, and the voice that smiled inside that human shell was not human at all. This intersection, bored man, ancient king, and a city of broken containment, was where theory met consequence. The first tactical development in their encounter was surgical rather than loud. Sukuna did not throw raw power in a blizzard. He tried to bind absence to form. Sukuna extended threads of corrosive intent through Yuji's body and wove them into the urban fabric, creating anchor points in masonry and metal that did not rely purely on cursed energy as previously measured. Those anchors were designed to latch onto whatever substrate the null tried to make vacant concrete rebar, the living memory stamped into city streets, and hold a pattern of corruption there so that even if Saitama erased a curse, something would remain to remember and regrow it. It was an adaptive tactic. If null cleansed, then seed the world with things that resist cleanup. The idea was elegant and cruel, and it changed the nature of the fight before either combatant had taken more than a single step. On a rooftop, Gojo Satoru watched Sukuna's tendrils find purchase and frowned in a way the cameras would have described as thoughtful had they been allowed to broadcast. He shouted down to the command vans, not because he thought force would win, but because precision might buy time. Use shadow-laced anchors to pull Sukuna's threads away from structural seams. Let Megumi map the new corrosion pattern, and force the King of Curses to waste movement on securing anchors rather than probing the anomaly. It was a risky countermeasure that depended on timing and on sorcerers willing to expose themselves to a danger they could not fully quantify. But Gojo understood that the fight's shape had changed. Containment alone would not work. They had to fight for the city as a geometry of surfaces and memories, not merely as a field of energy. Megumi responded by inventing a mapping technique in real time, improvising a network of shadow husk shikigami tied to physical coordinates that would hold spatial markers inside the null pockets long enough for instruments to read their outlines. Megumi Fushiguro used his shadows like anchors of a different kind. Where Sukuna sought to seed permanence into materials, Megumi tried to record and bind the absence itself, to give it a contour that technicians could translate. That maneuver was both brilliant and perilous because the shikigami required proximity. Operators had to stand in the null's wake and risk being erased from the energy map just to let the city remember what had been lost. The sacrifice was clinical rather than heroic, a scientist's wager that knowledge could become a weapon if it lived long enough to be turned into a tool. Sukuna, amused by the human struggle, escalated with a principle he had not needed in older wars: psychological bait. He began whispering old promises into Yuji's ears, conjuring memories of the world before the Jujutsu system had civilized hunger, and then he fed those memories into the anchors. The anchors answered him like hungry mouths, morphing from inert scars into active loci that resisted Saitama's cleansing influence. The short revelation that followed was ugly and precise. The null did not simply erase. It required an absence that was unanchored, and Sukuna's anchors were explicitly engineered to tie absence to matter. Where Saitama had been able to create clean, temporary pockets, these anchored scars burned like acid and persisted, making the loss irreversible on a scale the coalition had not foreseen. Yuji staggered as Sukuna pushed for more surface area, but the King of Curses did not want to possess the body fully. He wanted the man who walked bored through the rubble to react. Sukuna wanted to force a large, demonstrative response that would show whether null, when pushed, created a wave that healed or one that erased forever. If Saitama answered with violence, Sukuna planned to use that kinetic vector to propagate anchors deeper into the earth and across water mains, to embed null scars into the city's guts. It was a surgical escalation. Weaponize Saitama's own dominance by turning him into an unwitting vector for permanent change. That plan relied on human predictability, anger, reaction, escalation, and that human predictability had been, until now, a reliable constant. Saitama, predictably, gave no grand answer. He blinked at the sudden ringing in the air, at the tendrils threading the pavement like black vines, and he moved in the one way he always did when inconvenienced: a single step forward and a casual punch. The strike met nothing human could comprehend and still satisfied Sukuna's immediate curiosity. Where the blow landed, the anchors crackled and sometimes shattered, and in other places they ossified more firmly, as if the violence both cleansed and cemented in equal measure. That paradox was the evening's cruel lesson. Some anchors collapsed into dust, but other anchors seized the shock and converted it into deeper, molecular scars that would not simply regrow but change the material's properties. Buildings developed skeletal hollows where memory once lodged. Water channels ran clearer but silent of the old malice. And in the newly formed hollows, the city now carried permanent null wounds that censors labeled with a term analysts would soon hate. Gojo moved at that realization, not to fight Saitama, but to keep Sukuna honest and to shield civilians drawn like moths to catastrophe. He stepped forward with a technique tuned to interval rather than force, creating transient spatial buffers that redirected collapsing anchors away from hospitals and refuges. The maneuver did not aim to contain Sukuna, that was impossible, but to minimize the collateral permanence his anchors sought to create. But even as Gojo spun that defense, he watched Sukuna smile like a waiter who had finally been given a kitchen, because the King of Curses delighted in complexity and in watching layered strategies unfold. In the command vans, analysts felt their mental models rupture as data streamed in. Pockets of the city had already recorded irreversible null scarring, and those scars correlated precisely with where Saitama had struck while Sukuna's anchors had been active. The revelation was a hammer blow. The encounter had produced permanent environmental change. The consequence could not be rolled back by policy or prayer. Entire neighborhoods might never again host the same curse economy, and with those economies gone, the social contracts that depended on them, the quiet policing of malice, the obscure bargains of sacrifice, would change forever. As the first clash finished itself, and the night hummed with the sounds of rebuilding and alarm, a new and darker motion began. Sukuna, amused and intrigued, prepared to escalate further. He drew from Yuji's vessel a concentration of his will meant not merely to test, but to challenge, a direct, personal interaction aimed at Saitama that would not rely on anchors, but on presence, a promise to see whether the anomaly could be forced to react in a way that spread null scars beyond a single district. That preparation was visible to Gojo as a tightening of air and to Megumi as a shift in shadow geometry, and everyone who watched understood what it meant. The first clash had ended, and the second, far more consequential collision had already begun to move into place. The city no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a map being rewritten in real time. Districts that had once thrummed with the constant background hum of cursed energy now sat strangely quiet, while other blocks pulsed with violent spikes where Sukuna's anchors had bitten too deeply into the physical world. Military command vehicles had pulled back several kilometers after analysts confirmed the emergence of permanent null scars across infrastructure networks. Roads were evacuated, transit systems halted, and the skyline flickered with emergency lighting as authorities tried to prevent civilians from wandering into zones where the supernatural balance had collapsed entirely. The conflict had moved beyond containment or even strategy. Two forces were now interacting in ways that altered the fundamental rules governing the Jujutsu world. At the center of those changes stood Saitama, who had paused near the edge of an intersection while examining a torn grocery flyer he had picked up from the ground. The sale he had been searching for earlier that evening was apparently over, and he muttered quietly about how promotions never lasted long enough. Around him, the street looked like a disaster zone, cracked pavement, shattered windows, and faint distortions in the air where Sukuna's anchors had carved permanent marks into the environment. None of that seemed particularly alarming to him. Cities were always noisy and messy, and he assumed the authorities would fix things eventually. Several blocks away, the true architect of the night's chaos finally decided the experiment had reached its next stage. Sukuna no longer extended probing threads or subtle anchors. Instead, he allowed a portion of his presence to surface through Yuji's body with unmistakable authority. The air around the vessel warped as ancient cursed energy surged outward, thick enough to bend nearby shadows and rattle the broken windows of surrounding buildings. The King of Curses had concluded that indirect testing would not answer the question occupying his mind. The anomaly's ability to erase cursed energy made conventional techniques meaningless, so Sukuna intended to escalate into something far more fundamental, a direct confrontation between two incompatible forms of power. On a rooftop overlooking the intersection, Gojo Satoru felt the shift instantly. Sukuna's presence expanded with deliberate confidence, radiating the kind of pressure that once dominated entire eras of the Jujutsu world. Gojo recognized the significance of the moment immediately. This was not a probe or a trick. Sukuna was stepping into the battlefield personally, willing to risk direct contact with the anomaly in order to understand what kind of being could erase cursed energy so completely. Gojo did not intervene, not because he lacked the ability, but because interfering would only delay the inevitable collision between two forces that had already begun reshaping the world. Instead, he remained on the rooftop, arms folded, studying the unfolding confrontation with a mixture of fascination and concern. Across the command network, Megumi Fushiguro watched the energy readings spike into ranges that no instrument had ever recorded before. Sukuna's presence alone was producing density levels comparable to catastrophic cursed disasters from historical archives. Yet the sensors surrounding Saitama still reported the same impossible result: absolute zero cursed energy. Two incompatible realities were now approaching the same point in space. The tactical development introduced at this stage was something Sukuna had not used since the ancient era when he ruled the Jujutsu world directly. Instead of launching individual attacks, he began constructing a localized manifestation of his will that resembled the early formation of a domain expansion. Not a complete domain, but a compressed territory where his authority over cursed energy would become absolute. The ground beneath Yuji's feet fractured as jagged lines of cursed script burned into the pavement, spreading outward in a circular pattern that warped the surrounding environment. This incomplete domain did not aim to trap Saitama. It aimed to overwrite the rules of the battlefield itself. If cursed energy defined Sukuna's sovereignty, then flooding the environment with overwhelming density might force the anomaly to interact with it on some measurable level. The King of Curses wanted to see whether absolute dominance over cursed energy could impose itself even on a being who possessed none. The expanding field rolled across the intersection like an invisible tide. Buildings groaned as pressure filled the air, and distant surveillance drones lost signal when the density exceeded their operational limits. Within seconds, the localized territory had become a miniature kingdom of cursed energy, where Sukuna's influence saturated every surface. Saitama finally looked up from the flyer. He noticed the strange symbols spreading across the pavement and the sudden heaviness in the air. For a moment, he simply stared at the phenomenon with mild curiosity, trying to decide whether it represented another monster or just some elaborate street performance. Then Sukuna spoke. The voice that emerged from Yuji's body carried a layered resonance that seemed to vibrate through the city itself. "So you are the thing that erases my kind." The statement was not angry or hostile. It was curious. Saitama scratched the back of his head and answered in the same casual tone he used in everyday conversations. "I guess you're another monster, right?" The simplicity of the reply made Sukuna's grin widen, because the anomaly clearly had no idea who he was. For centuries, the King of Curses had been feared as an unstoppable force within the Jujutsu hierarchy. Yet the bald man standing across the street looked at him with the same mild disinterest he had shown toward every other curse that week. That indifference was more insulting than any challenge. Sukuna raised one hand slowly, allowing the dense cursed energy filling his incomplete domain to condense into a single blade-shaped distortion hovering above his palm. The weapon carried enough destructive potential to slice through entire city blocks, yet Sukuna focused it carefully toward a single target. This would not be a random attack. This would be the first true strike in a confrontation that could redefine the balance of the entire supernatural world. Across the rooftops and command networks, every observer realized the same thing at the same time. If Sukuna's full power collided directly with the anomaly's null effect, the resulting shockwave might not simply destroy buildings or erase curses. It might permanently alter the structure of cursed energy itself. And in the quiet intersection below, Saitama stretched one arm lazily, as if preparing for another routine punch. The strike began so quietly that most observers almost missed the moment it started. The blade of condensed cursed energy above Sukuna's hand did not explode outward in dramatic fashion. Instead, it compressed further, becoming denser and darker as the incomplete domain around him forced every particle of cursed energy in the immediate district to obey his will. The air vibrated with unbearable pressure as the weapon stabilized into something closer to a law than a technique. Across the surveillance network, instruments screamed with warnings as energy density readings surged beyond theoretical limits. Analysts watching the monitors understood that Sukuna was no longer testing the anomaly. He was unleashing a strike designed to demonstrate absolute supremacy within the cursed hierarchy. In the empty intersection below, Saitama looked up at the distortion forming above the other man's palm and sighed softly. From his perspective, the attack resembled a dramatic buildup typical of monsters he encountered during routine hero work. They always seemed to enjoy elaborate introductions before charging in, and he had long ago developed a habit of waiting patiently for them to finish. He rolled his shoulders once, stretched his arms slightly, and then placed the grocery bag down beside a broken traffic light so it would not tear when he moved. Several rooftops away, Gojo Satoru narrowed his eyes behind the blindfold as Sukuna's domain pressure intensified. Gojo had witnessed countless battles between powerful sorcerers, but the interaction unfolding here did not resemble any duel from the Jujutsu tradition. Normally, combat between top-tier entities involved layered techniques, countermeasures, and tactical positioning. This confrontation looked almost primitive by comparison, Sukuna wielding overwhelming cursed energy density against a man whose existence erased that energy entirely. "Here we go," Gojo murmured quietly. Inside the command vehicle, coordinating remaining evacuation efforts, Megumi Fushiguro watched the energy maps collapse into something that barely resembled data anymore. Sukuna's incomplete domain had saturated the district so completely that normal measurement tools could not distinguish individual readings. Yet the center of that distortion still showed the same impossible result, a blank spot where Saitama stood, untouched by the overwhelming field surrounding him. The two phenomena were about to collide directly. Sukuna moved first. The blade of condensed cursed energy sliced downward with surgical precision, cutting through the space between buildings as if the city itself were made of paper. The attack did not produce a loud explosion. Instead, it created a silent fracture across the intersection where Saitama stood, a line of destruction capable of dividing entire districts if left unchecked. For the first time that night, Saitama actually looked mildly focused. He stepped forward and threw a punch, not a dramatic full-power strike, just a simple punch delivered with slightly more intent than his earlier swats. The collision happened faster than any sensor could track. Sukuna's blade touched the edge of Saitama's fist for less than a fraction of a second, and in that instant, the entire district experienced something that had never occurred in the recorded history of Jujutsu. Instead of deflecting the cursed technique or clashing with it like two opposing forces, Saitama's punch erased the blade completely. The dense cursed energy composing Sukuna's attack did not explode outward or disperse. It vanished. The erasure propagated backward through the attack structure. The incomplete domain surrounding Sukuna collapsed instantly as the null effect traveled along the technique's energy pathways like a reverse lightning strike. Symbols carved into the pavement disintegrated. Pressure filling the air evaporated. Every fragment of cursed energy forming the battlefield dissolved into absolute nothingness. For several seconds, the entire district registered zero cursed energy. Not low, not suppressed, but zero. On the rooftop above, Gojo lowered his head slightly as the sudden emptiness washed over the city. Even his extraordinary perception struggled to interpret what had just happened. Sukuna's attack had not simply failed. The energy sustaining it had been removed from existence entirely. Across the command network, analysts stared at screens showing blank readings where overwhelming density had existed moments before. The phenomenon spread outward like a cleansing shockwave, erasing clusters of curses throughout multiple neighborhoods. But the most astonishing reaction came from Sukuna himself. For the first time since emerging onto the battlefield, the King of Curses looked genuinely surprised. His grin faded slowly as he studied the empty air where his technique had existed seconds earlier. The cursed energy he commanded with absolute authority had simply ceased to exist upon touching Saitama's fist. And worse still, the null shockwave from that contact had destabilized the deeper anchors he had planted earlier in the night. Permanent null scars across the city began expanding unpredictably as Sukuna's corrupted anchors lost the energy binding them together. Infrastructure systems previously warped by cursed influence started reverting to neutral states. Areas that had once generated curses through accumulated negativity suddenly became inert zones where curses could not manifest at all. The ecosystem sustaining the cursed hierarchy was collapsing. Inside Yuji's mind, Sukuna felt the implications instantly. His centuries of dominance had relied on the existence of cursed energy as a universal constant. If an entity capable of erasing that substance spread its influence across the world, the entire foundation of the Jujutsu order could vanish. Yet instead of anger, Sukuna began laughing, not with amusement but with recognition, because he finally understood the truth about the anomaly standing across the intersection. Saitama was not part of the cursed hierarchy. He was something outside it entirely. And that meant defeating him through traditional means was impossible. The King of Curses straightened slowly as the last remnants of his incomplete domain evaporated into the night air. For the first time in centuries, Sukuna acknowledged a force that did not belong within the world he ruled. But the conflict was not finished yet, because the collapse of the cursed hierarchy had only begun. For several seconds after the collision between Sukuna's technique and Saitama's fist, the city existed in a silence that no one alive had ever experienced. The absence was not simply quiet streets or halted alarms. It was something deeper, something structural. Sensors across the entire metropolitan monitoring network continued reporting the same impossible measurement: absolute zero cursed energy across the district where the clash had occurred. What had once been the most volatile supernatural battlefield in the country now resembled an empty desert of spiritual activity. In the intersection below the shattered skyline, Saitama looked down at his hand for a moment, flexed his fingers once, and then shrugged as if the result had been entirely expected. From his perspective, the fight had been brief and slightly inconvenient, nothing more complicated than dealing with another unusually talkative monster. He bent down, picked up the grocery bag he had set beside the traffic light, and checked whether the carton of eggs inside had survived the shockwave. After confirming that nothing had cracked, he nodded to himself with quiet satisfaction. Across the street, Sukuna stood perfectly still inside Yuji's body while the last remnants of his domain collapsed into the air around him. The King of Curses had not been injured in the conventional sense. Saitama's punch had never touched his physical form, yet the result of that collision had reached far deeper than any wound. The energy sustaining his authority over the battlefield had simply vanished. For the first time since his rebirth within the modern era, Sukuna faced an opponent whose existence invalidated the foundation of his power. He studied the bald man standing across the intersection with an expression that mixed irritation and something closer to reluctant admiration. A being that erased cursed energy itself could not be defeated through techniques, domains, or even raw supremacy. The hierarchy Sukuna had ruled for centuries simply did not apply. His laughter returned, quieter now. "Well," he said through Yuji's mouth, "that answers that." Then Sukuna withdrew. not in defeat, but in acknowledgement that further escalation would accomplish nothing tonight. The King of Curses receded into the depths of Yuji's consciousness, leaving the exhausted vessel standing alone in the silent intersection. Yuji collapsed to one knee as the pressure vanished from his body. He looked around the empty district in confusion, trying to understand why the suffocating presence that had filled the city moments earlier had disappeared completely. On the rooftop above, Gojo Satoru exhaled slowly as he sensed Sukuna's withdrawal. The sudden calm across the city felt almost surreal after days of escalating catastrophe. Gojo understood the significance of what had just happened more clearly than anyone else present. The King of Curses had encountered something outside the Jujutsu system, and he had chosen not to continue the fight. Gojo jumped down from the rooftop and landed lightly near the intersection where Saitama stood examining his groceries. He studied the bald hero for several seconds before speaking. "You realize," Gojo said casually, "you just erased the most powerful cursed technique in existence." Saitama glanced up, mildly confused. "Huh, that guy with the weird face tattoos." Gojo laughed. "Yes, that one." Saitama nodded thoughtfully, as if the explanation cleared everything up. "Oh, okay." The simplicity of the response made Gojo laugh harder than he had all week. Several kilometers away, the command center monitoring the crisis erupted into frantic discussion as analysts reviewed the latest data streams. Entire districts that previously hosted dense curse populations now showed permanent null readings. The shockwave from Saitama's final punch had expanded the earlier environmental scars into something far larger. Cities across the region would never produce curses the same way again. Megumi Fushiguro stared at the final reports in stunned silence. The Jujutsu system had always relied on a predictable cycle. Negative emotions created cursed energy, which manifested as curses that sorcerers exorcised to maintain balance. That cycle now contained massive gaps where cursed energy simply could not accumulate anymore. Entire sectors of the curse ecosystem had been erased permanently. For ordinary civilians, the change would appear as a gradual decline in unexplained disasters, hauntings, and supernatural incidents. Governments would quietly celebrate the improvement in public safety while struggling to explain the phenomenon internally. For the Jujutsu world, however, the consequences were far more complicated. Sorcerers existed to combat curses. If curses began disappearing from major population centers entirely, the centuries-old hierarchy governing Jujutsu society would eventually collapse. Across the silent city blocks, Saitama began walking away from the intersection toward the subway station. The entire conflict that had reshaped the supernatural order lasted less than a minute from his perspective. He was mostly thinking about whether he could still catch the last train home before the schedule changed. Behind him, Gojo watched the retreating figure with an amused expression. "You know," he said quietly to himself, "we might have to rewrite the textbooks." High above the city, surveillance drones captured the final image of the night. A lone man walking through streets where curses could no longer exist, leaving behind a world that had fundamentally changed because he happened to pass through it. The balance between curses and sorcerers would never return to its previous form. The Jujutsu hierarchy that had ruled for centuries had encountered something it could not categorize, control, or defeat. And somewhere in the depths of Yuji's mind, Sukuna smiled in the darkness, already imagining what a world without cursed energy might become. The era of curses had not ended completely. But after tonight, it would never rule the world the same way again.